Okay, good evening. Welcome to the first lecture in our IBC Bank and Commerce Bank Keynote Speaker Series for 2024 and 2025. My name is George Clark. I'm the Director of the Center for the Study of Western Hemispheric Trade in TAMIU's A.R. Sanchez Jr. School of Business. Our center, with support from IBC Bank and Commerce Bank, brings speakers to talk about topics in the areas of international trade, international economics, finance, demography, immigration, and democracy. So before introducing today's speaker, I'd like to thank our sponsors for supporting this event, IBC Bank and Commerce Bank. With their support, we've been able to bring many thought-provoking speakers over the years to TAMIU and Laredo. I also want to do a little bit of housekeeping for the students here. At the end of Dr. Eden's presentation, there'll be a question and answer session. We'll take questions from the audience in attendance here today, as well as from those joining virtually. For those in attendance, please raise your hand and one of our student assistants will bring you a microphone. It's important that you have the microphone so everyone can hear you. If you don't like talking out loud in a crowded room and you're in the audience, you can also submit a question via Slido. There's a QR code on the front of your program. If you scan it, you can submit questions that way, and then they will come to me and I will be able to read them to the speaker. Finally, we don't want to leave all the people virtually out from the question and answer session. So for you, you can submit your questions through the Q&A feature in Teams. We'll try to address as many questions as we can in our allotted time. For students attending in person and on behalf of one of your classes, you should have your student ID scanned at the door. In addition, you were provided with a QR code which takes you to an online form where you will submit your class information. Finally, you'll scan your ID when departing once the lecture's ended. For students attending online, your class information should have been submitted during the registration process. So that's it for housekeeping. So now I want to introduce our speaker. So today's speaker is Dr. Lorraine Eden. Dr. Eden is a professor Emerita of Management and an adjunct professor of law at Texas A&M University. She was one of the founding scholars of transfer pricing economics. She's a member of the 2022 to 2025 United Nations Subcommittee on Transfer Pricing and an affiliated expert with the Analysis Group. Her scholarly publications have put her in the top 2% of the world's most cited research scientists. Dr. Eden has served as the editor-in-chief in the Journal of International Business Studies, the president of the Academy of International Business, and the dean of the AIB Fellows. She received the 2012 AIB President's Award, the 2016 WAIB Woman of the Year Award, and two 2019 JIBS 50th Anniversary Gold Medals for scholarly and service contributions. In 2024, the state of Texas commissioned her as a Yellow Rose of Texas for her community service and philanthropy. So let's welcome Dr. Eden to TAMIU and Laredo.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Clark, for that very nice introduction. And thank you all of us for joining us tonight. I want to also thank the IBC Bank and the Commerce Bank for this event. And so let me get started and I'll talk with you. I just want to make sure that we're having a little echo here. I think we're okay. Is it me? Sorry. Okay. I get my clicker. What I want to talk to you today is about something called taxing multinational enterprises. I wrote my PhD dissertation many, many years ago on thinking about how one should tax large multinationals. That's multinationals that are parent in one country and have subsidiaries in multiple other countries. Anyone here in Laredo knows exactly what I'm talking about because there are many firms that are headquartered here that have subsidiaries in Mexico. Many Mexican firms have subsidiaries here in the United States. So you're familiar with these kinds of firms. What you may not be familiar a lot with is the taxation of these firms. We talk a lot about trade, we talk about foreign direct investment, we talk less about how they're taxed. And I want to explain to you why tax is so important and what's going on in the global economy right now that is so unusual, and I think may fit the Latin slogan of we may have dragons ahead, right? That is possibility of problems that may occur in the global economy. So let's talk about Sunt, Dracones, turbulent times ahead in terms of taxing multinationals. I'm going to divide my talk into 4 parts. First of all, I have to set the story up by talking to you about what international tax cooperation is, which means I want to sort of set up how we tax firms now and why we do what we do. Then what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about how for the last, really since about 2012, the OECD, which is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is what I guess most of us would call the rich country clubs. It's the wealthiest countries in the world. What the wealthiest countries in the world have been doing to think about how we should tax the large multinationals in the global economy. I'm then going to talk about what's going on at the United Nations. As Dr. Clark told you, I'm sitting on a UN subcommittee. It's a subcommittee in my specialty area, which is transfer pricing, which is how you price products that move within multinationals. So you have a firm here in Laredo that sells a part that's being made and assembled in a maquiladora in Nuevo Laredo, for example, and then it comes back across the border again, how that is priced. My little subcommittee is one of many subcommittees that sits under the big United Nations Tax Committee. All right, and the tax committee has members of tax authorities all over the world sitting on this committee. And it's engaged right now, as we sit here, they are meeting in Geneva, in Switzerland, talking about what's going on at the UN in terms of tax. And then I want to move from that big global picture and bring it back and talk to you about Laredo and Texas and what it might mean for you. One of the things I'm kind of hoping, I'm glad to see so many students here tonight, I want to tell you it's been a fabulous career for me. I taught a course in this at Texas A&M from 2007 through 2019 when my husband and I retired. I had more than 350 students who went through learning international tax and transfer pricing with me. They went out, they came from the Bush School, came from economics, came from accounting, came from finance, they came from agricultural economics, they came from engineering. What brought them together was a shared interest in understanding how we tax firms, and more than a third of them went off and are now professional people in the field working for big 4 firms like Ernst & Young, PwC, working in many of our banks and working in many of our national tax authorities. I think it's a really cool and rewarding career, even though it's about tax, and most of us think tax is kind of a boring subject, right? So that's what I want to talk to you about today. And my first stop is then to sort of set the stage. And I want to talk about what is international tax cooperation and why is it so important. And basically the idea behind here is that every government taxes the firms in their country. And they want to tax them basically so as to set it up properly in terms of having principles that guide how their taxes, the objectives behind the taxes. They set up a whole set of rules, and then they have dispute settlement procedures. And each country could do that alone. We could go independently, which would give us great national sovereignty if we went alone. But the problem is when you go alone, there are spillovers and things that happen to other countries. And so it makes sense to cooperate and get together, and through international cooperation, just like we have free trade agreements. So we have trade cooperation, for example. We have cooperation on the environment, right? On issues that span across borders, it's really useful when governments get together and set up cooperation. So the benefits: foster cross-border flows, encourage economic growth, and obviously raise tax revenues. It does cost something in national sovereignty, because when countries work together and they agree on a common set of rules, you give up the right to set this all on your own. So these are, I think, the reasons here. Now, if we don't do that, if every country sets up their own form of international tax system, their own way to tax multinationals. One of the things that happens, and I was talking about that today, is every location wants to attract firms in. They want foreign direct investment to come in. They want investment to come in. In order to do that, most city governments, for example, will offer incentives, locational incentives to bring firms to come to Laredo, for example. Texas offers incentives to bring people to Texas. And what happens then is if a firm wants to come in and big plant. So, for example, you probably all heard, about a year and a half ago, Intel announced it was going to set up, Intel was going to set up a big semiconductor plant. And it could have been anywhere in the United States, and multiple cities across the United States competed to get that Intel plant, offering a variety of locational subsidies for that, to attract that plant in. One of the problems that happens is, it's one thing when it happens inside a country, but when it happens across countries, that kind of competition can lead to a race to the bottom. It can lead to what are commonly called beauty contests, where governments compete to get in here. And so I want to move on from there then to say, if this is the way, if we want to set up a form of international tax cooperation, how do we go about doing this? And now I need to explain to you a little bit about the rules for here. There are a series of basically 8 rules, or 8 types of way that we do when we set up an international tax system now. The first that deals with multinational enterprises. The first thing we do is we have to decide who are the residence countries and who are the source countries. The residence country is where the parent firm is. So if it's American multinational, the United States is the residence country because that's where the American firm is. Now, an American firm, like say Intel, for example, will have subsidiaries around the world. All of those are called the source countries or the host countries where the foreign direct investment is located. And so we have typically American multinationals have subsidiaries in Mexico, they have them in Canada, they have them in Ireland, they have them in China, they have them in Japan. One multinational can be in 40 to 100 different source countries. Now, those countries have to decide which forms of multinational income are taxed by whom. In other words, if you think about the incomes that firms earn, they earn corporate profits, they pay dividends back home, they have to pay if you have patents or other forms of intellectual property, you have to pay royalty payments for the use of those patents, you have to pay license fees. If you have cross-border services where you have an engineer goes down to work in Mexico City, that engineer has to be compensated for the services being provided. So there's all kinds of these types of forms of income that go back and forth across the border in a multinational enterprise, and you have to decide who has the right to tax them. The rules in the United States and most everywhere are the following. They are based on the concept of nexus. Nexus means, are you effectively connected to that? And the old rules used to be, did you actually have a physical plant there? So if Intel opened a plant in Botswana and it had a proper physical plant there, then Botswana would actually have nexus and have the right to tax the profits that were earned by that Botswana affiliate. So the rule of nexus determines which country, source or residence, has the right to tax. Now, if they both tax, then what happens is you get double taxed, right? You get taxed both by the parent company, the residence country, and you get taxed by the source country where the subsidiary is. And firms don't like being double taxed, right? That means, if you have a 30% tax in one country and a 20% in another, you could pay 50% of your profits in tax. So the rule is we have to decide who goes first. And the traditional rule is that where the income is earned goes first. So the source country, Botswana, gets the right to tax the income. And then the United States gets the right to levy a tax on top if it wishes to do so, but it has to give a credit for the Botswana tax, right? Now, the rules are a little bit more complicated than that, but not much. A couple of other things. One thing is the United States, for most of its history, has had something called deferral. which means if you have active income, active business income, you can keep the profits from that in Botswana, offshore, until you decide to bring them home, which means you never bring them home. On the other hand, if it's considered sort of passive income, like royalty payments, for example, not directly tied with active business, then typically what the United States has done under the rules is tax on an accrual basis. So we have this system where basically American multinationals, the United States has had the right to tax American multinationals, both apparent as earned, and from worldwide, from all of the subsidiaries, but it made a conscious choice to say if that income was being earned from active business, you can defer it and keep it offshore until you bring it home. If it's from passive, we are actually going to tax it. Now, so you can imagine what multinationals try to do. They want to move it out of the passive box and move it into the active box, because that means you get to keep it offshore. Now, two more pieces and we're done on this side. As I said to you, my area of research has been on transfer pricing, which is on how firms price the products that move across the border. That's goods, services, intangible, and now digital transactions can also be taxed. So we have different rules for these, but the basic underlying concept is you don't want multinational firms to have an unfair advantage over domestic firms. So the rule is you want to price what arm's length parties, arm's length means like this, being at arm's length, unrelated, what unrelated parties would do. And one more piece of information says that there's going to be disputes. There's always going to be disputes across countries. I'm going to say, I'm the source, and you're going to say, no, this is mine. This one is going to say, this is active business income. That one's going to say, no, that one's passive, or I don't like your transfer price. What we have used basically since World War II is a network of bilateral tax treaties where the countries sit down and negotiate the tax treaties. So you should know the United States has a tax treaty with Canada. The United States has a tax treaty with Mexico. Mexico has a tax treaty with Canada. So we have 3 tax treaties just in these 3 countries. We do not have one tax treaty with all 3 of us in it, which is probably what we should have, like we have in the NAFTA, right? We have one agreement for trade, all 3 countries sign on, right? But we have not done that in tax. We have bilateral all the way. Okay. From the 30s to the 80s, this is pretty much what happened. Most countries taxed on a worldwide basis. The US in particular had a very high rate. It did. And most country rates were under it. We had these rules on active and passive, and we had these rules on what happened with double tax treaties. And what the result of this was this picture. What I've shown you in this little picture is, I want you to think this 30% rate one over here is the United States. And then you've got a 20% rate country, I don't know, maybe that was Ireland at the time, 20%. And then you've got a tax haven down there at 10. And then you've got Canada up there at about 25. And then you've got Japan in the far corner that had a higher rate than the United States rate was. That meant any American multinational, its tax rate really governed all of its worldwide subsidiaries because they got a foreign tax credit for any taxes they paid in the host country. What the blue line is showing you is, in effect, what we used to do was an umbrella where the United States, as I don't know if I got any political scientists in the room, but if you've studied any international relations theory, you've probably heard the concept of a hegemon. The hegemon is the worldwide leader, and the United States focused in this period as the worldwide leader, as the hegemonic power. It set a tax rate that basically was a tax rate for everybody else until 1987. In 1987, the United States dropped the rate, and then guess what happened? Everybody else followed. Because this umbrella across the rates created a lot of similarity, except for some outliers, like Japan was on the outside. Now, this thing fell apart in the 90s. And it fell apart in the 1990s for a whole pile of reasons. First of all a lot of small countries realized they could set themselves up as tax havens and have very small tax rates and attract inward foreign direct investment. One of the most successful at this was actually Ireland. Ireland deliberately set up a tax system that had a very low rate, and Ireland was the way to get into the European Union. So American multinationals at this point in time, in the late 80s, Microsoft, for example, I talked to someone this afternoon about Microsoft in the middle 1990s. I'm old enough to have used Windows 95. Windows 95 was done in Cupertino, California. Microsoft set up a subsidiary very soon after in Ireland, and through a cost-sharing arrangement, managed to move the intellectual property to Ireland, and then Ireland, Windows 97 and the subsequent versions of Windows, much of the profits of those have come out of that Irish subsidiary. This was the first of a large series of American multinationals that realized that they could move some of their activities offshore into tax havens. And at the same time this was happening, the European Union countries started switching from worldwide taxation to territorial. Territorial means you don't tax your subsidiaries, your foreign subsidiaries. All you do is tax the parent at home. And if the subsidiaries keep the money offshore, it doesn't get taxed. It only gets taxed offshore. And I'm going to show you in a minute a slide showing how the European countries started moving from worldwide taxation to territorial taxation, and the rates start to fall. Coupled with that, a whole bunch of loopholes started to emerge in the international tax system. Some of these you may have read about. I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, the Dutch sandwich. Is this ring a bell? Anybody here heard about the Dutch sandwich? We're all Mexicans. Well, the maquiladoras are a form of tax preference, a very specific and a very old form of tax preference, right? Started for the auto industry. I'll give you another example. Think about Puerto Rico. Section 936 in the United States and Puerto Rico encouraged the movement of the pharmaceutical multinationals to Puerto Rico. A whole variety of these kinds of tax preferences. Let me ask you a question. How many of you have been to the Caribbean islands? Bermuda, Barbados, all right, Cayman Islands, all right, Bahamas. If you visited any of them, what you should notice is the presence of huge banks right downtown in these cities and the large high-rise skyscrapers here and the amount of economic development that has happened. Part of this is from the fact that Cayman Islands, may I hold you for a second? Because I will take your questions, that's okay. So this was happening. And the big change, I think, and we all noticed it and watched it, didn't think very much about it. The big change that happens, and you would all, I think, have been around most of in that period of time, was 2008, 2009, and the financial crash. When Lehman Brothers went down, for example, and you name some of the other firms that you had this huge crash, liquidity crunch crisis. I remember when I was teaching my Texas A&M students, that was the one year I was training transfer pricing students, and they had a hard time getting jobs because, it was just everything fell apart in the financial crisis. So here's what I meant when I was saying these are countries that had worldwide taxation and then shifted to saying, I'm only going to tax in my country. The formal expression is tax to the water's edge. Only tax within the borders. I'm not taxing those foreign firms. My subsidiary's offshore. You get to keep it offshore. So almost everybody switches. And when the United States switched? The United States switched in 2017 with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. We also finally followed everybody down and moved to a territorial system. Now, remember the blue line I had with Japan sticking out over the top? Look what happens if you only tax inside your borders. The parent firm only gets taxed at home and none of its subsidiaries get taxed. Look at the difference in the rates. Now, we all live on a border. Anyone that lives on the border understands there can often be two prices on one side and on the other, and you can do the transaction in terms of the currency exchange and decide which side of the border is cheaper. I'm a Canadian. I grew up on the Canada-US border. I often said any border child knows how to do foreign exchange rates. I understood how to do Canada-US dollar calculations in high school. I expect most of you can do US peso calculations in your head. You know whether things are cheaper in Nuevo Laredo than when they're cheaper over here on the Laredo side of the border. I used to go over on the Canadian side of the border and bring things back. I can tell you some stories another time about going with my father, bringing back American cigarettes and margarine. Was a very common thing when I was growing up. My point in saying this is border children understand arbitrage. You understand that when there are differences in rates, there's money to be made. There's profitable opportunities to be made when there's arbitrage opportunities. And I'm showing you here the arbitrage opportunities that began when countries moved from worldwide to territorial taxation. Now, what that meant was I'm now moved from tax cooperation to tax competition. And remember what I said, what happens when you got tax competition? With tax competition, if you want to attract inward foreign direct investment, you got to engage in a beauty contest. You have to make your country look very attractive for foreign direct investment. You want to offer low tax rates. You want to offer subsidies for coming in, a tax holiday for the first 5 years. And what happens is you probably even want to set up a one-stop shop. A one-stop shop is an agency inside your government, and it handles all the applications for foreign direct investment to come in, and it does the negotiations on what happens in order to attract that in. I went, you may be interested in this, I got invited once to speak at a conference in Dubai. And in Dubai, what it was a meeting of all of these one-stop shops all over the world, that the whole thing they did was they were designed to attract inward foreign direct investment. And it was in the big Dubai Convention Center, and everybody had a booth. Every country had a booth, and they were all telling you all the wonderful things you would get if you came and you did your foreign direct investment and all the tax advantages and everything. That's this. This is showing the race to the bottom in corporate income tax rates. Over here on the side is 1990. Over there on the right is 2018. So in the space of 30 years, tax rates went from an average of basically 46% down to in half. Corporate income tax rates fell in half. Now, oh, sorry, I missed one here. And this is showing you the same picture. You can see the high bunch is sort of the 80s at the top, 90s, 2000, 2010s, 2021, and the tax rates are all falling, moving over the side. On the picture on the right, this is a very recent picture of the Tax Foundation. The red ones are the high tax rates. So basically, you could see who still basically has high tax rates. Latin America, the LATAM countries, and Africa. Both countries have statutory rates that are higher than almost any other countries in the world now. Now, here's a very different picture. These are estimates on profit shifting, of moving your profits out of high tax countries to low tax countries. Why? Because of arbitrage opportunities. I can take advantage of the differences in the rates, and I can use a variety of financial methods, including transfer pricing, to move the profits out of the high tax country to the low tax country. And you can see the estimates here, and I'm going to show you some more. This is a 2022 paper, and there's another one here. This one is 2016, and it's U.S. multinationals only. And it's showing where U.S. multinationals currently book their profits. You see number one on the list up there? Ireland. Then Bermuda and the Caribbean, further down, Switzerland, Netherlands, Singapore. Half of all the foreign profits of multinationals in 2016 went in those locations. Ireland, Bermuda, Caribbean, Switzerland, Netherlands, and Singapore. Half of all the profits were declared in those jurisdictions. Right. Okay. And there's another picture basically showing you the same thing. The list down the side shows you the countries that have attracted the most inward foreign direct investment And then it tells you what percent of their taxes are versus the number of people who are there. And then it does a calculation of the average rate. So Ireland up there in the top, the effective tax rate, 4%. Okay, so that's not the statutory rate. The statutory rate is the published rate. The effective rate is what the firms on average are actually paying that are located in Ireland in this window. Okay, one more and I got to make this slide. There it is, okay. So let me sum up what I've talked to you, what I've said here. I've tried to talk to you a little bit about what is, how we set up international taxes for multinational enterprises. And you can either cooperate or you can have competition among countries. The system was one that originally encouraged cooperation, but very clearly starting about the year, I would say 1990, there's been a shift towards the type of system that encourages more loopholes, more arbitrage opportunities, and multinational enterprises are nothing if not ambitious and innovative and have figured out how to take advantage of this and have been paying less tax. Okay. I've missed one slide. Hang on, this clicker is moving maybe I need to move it this way. Okay, I think maybe it's the next, no? Hang on a second, I just want to show you if I can figure out where there it is. Okay, one back further. Yes, and you're probably familiar with this. This has been much more in the European Union than it has been in the United States. But if you've traveled anywhere in Europe over the last 10 years, particularly right after the financial crisis, what you saw was often huge demonstrations in the street that were very anti a lot of multinational enterprises because the data came out in terms of how low the taxes were that were being paid in many of these countries. So you see, I had named Google. There's Google up there. There's Starbucks. There's Amazon, right? Apple. And as a result, there have been a variety of court cases that have been going on over the years. And there have been, CEOs of these firms have been in testifying in court, trying to explain. And also here in the United States, there have been hearings here in the US too about firms not paying taxes. Okay, so let me bring you up to where we are, I would say, most recently. After the financial collapse in 2008, 2009, which moved the economy into a global recession, it was very clear that we needed to do something to fix the system, to encourage tax cooperation again. And what happened was the OECD, this group of primarily residence-based countries where the largest multinationals are headquartered, started doing some work. And I'm going to talk to you through very quickly what the OECD has been doing and then what's going on now at the UN. Try this way. Yes, okay. All right, so let me, yes, okay. Been three of these. The OECD's engaged in three types of projects. The first was completely unsuccessful. The very first one was naming and shaming. Basically, in 1998, the OECD published a report on abusive tax havens, and it created an index and a list of countries that were considered to be abusive tax havens. It also created a list of harmful preferential practices. What I mean by that is these were incentives to get firms to locate in a particular place that were considered to be actually negative impacts on competition. And it didn't really name or shame anybody on that list. Now, most of the havens were non-OECD members. Most of the harmful tax practices were OECD members. So the naming and shaming was going on primarily of firms in Asia, in Latin America, and in Africa, and in the Caribbean, and it didn't go over very well. And so this project, the first project, really was not successful at all. Then the OECD moved again and started two base erosion and profit shifting projects. They're called BEPS, and you may have heard the term BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting. I'm going to talk briefly about both of these. The first of these base erosion and profit shifting ones ended up in 2015. So I was teaching class and they came out, I think, in mid-September 2015, a list of action items that were going to fix the system. And let me just sort of characterize those action items. The first action item on the list was do something about taxing digital. This is 2015. Let me think. Google is created in when? When you remember, anybody remember? Google starts as a firm in 1997, 98. And Gmail comes a couple of years after that. So we're talking the sort of very end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, we see the rise of the digital giants that we have today, the Googles and the Amazons and the Apples and the other firms, the Netflix and so on. So the first is, how do we tax digital? The next group are, how do we fill the loopholes in the system? The Dutch sandwich I mentioned, or the two-headed Irish, where it was headquartered in one country and then it was headquartered in another country if you looked either side. A whole group of these tax preferences. How do we fix those loopholes in the system? Third group was, how do we work on transfer pricing, which is my area? How do we actually make the transfer pricing rules work better? And then there's a whole group of rules that talk about how do we cooperate and coordinate better at the government level? How do we bring governments together to think about how to do this better? And so that's it. First one was digital. Then there's how do we fix loopholes? How do we fix transfer pricing? And then how do we make governments cooperate better on all these tax treaty items? And they created something called the multilateral instrument and opened it up for signing. And a lot of countries have signed, and some of them are ratifying. This is from 2015, is now 2024. We're almost 10 years later, all right? And we're still doing it. It's very slow. So it hasn't really had much impact yet, as it should. What happened then, the OECD made an attempt again. And this is what's called the second BEPS round, the second round on base erosion and profit shifting. And this is the one that is going on as we speak. This really started right when, just about the time that the WHO announced that COVID was a global pandemic. I don't know where you were. My husband and I were hiking in Joshua Tree National Forest at the time, you know, when we heard on the radio that it was a global pandemic. What's that, February 2020? And we were out in California and came back and were in the house in College Station, Texas for a year, you know, under lockdown. Everybody that was in classes went home and started doing stuff online. The OECD decided that was the time it was going to come out with what they called Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And Pillar 1 had a Part A and a Part B, and Pillar 2 had a Part A and a Part B. So it had 4 proposals. All 4 proposals, that was 2020, now is the end of 2024. All 4 proposals are still going on now. And I want to just tell you, because depending upon who we elect in November, and depending upon what the government decides to do, some of these are going to happen, and some of these are not. And they're going to affect all the firms in the United States, the foreign firms in the United States, and the American firms in the United States, and the firms in Texas, and the firms in Laredo. Any firm that's a multinational enterprise is going to be affected by this. And this is coming down the tubes, and most people have no idea. I think it's like the Dracones, you know, the big shock wave that's coming, the tsunami that may be coming, that we really aren't prepared for. So let me summarize the first one. The first one was directly to deal with the digital giants, and it was basically to say what was happening is we were having all kinds of digital sales and services taxes. Now, let me bring that home to you, what I mean by that. A simple example is I have a Kindle app on my iPhone, and I buy books on my Kindle. I also buy physical books still, some. You get your textbooks too. You probably get your textbooks on the Kindle now, right? Or you can read them on your laptop. Amazon now has warehouses in Texas, and if you order something that is coming in that way, you're going to be paying a tax. You'll notice there's a tax when you order from Amazon now, right? Some things have taxes and some things don't. And you only really know. If I order a movie from Netflix, When the movie comes in, I don't know if there's a tax on it or there's not a tax on it. You buy furniture from Wayfair. Wayfair now delivers over the internet to you something, you're going to be paying tax on it. So this whole issue was the United States has been trying to get rid of digital taxes. Doesn't want digital taxes on sales, doesn't want digital taxes on services. Why? Because we have the largest digital giants in the world are here. You know, Nokia is in Finland, there's a couple in Japan, you know, but most of the world's multinationals in the digital industry and Industry 4.0 are here in the United States. And they don't like digital sales taxes and digital services taxes. They don't like they want a moratorium on electronic transmissions and a variety of other things. So Pillar 1 Amount A was designed to discourage digital taxes. And the whole idea behind it is the quid pro quo for having 100 multinationals pay some money to other countries, market jurisdictions, is that every country in the world is going to give up its digital services taxes and sales taxes. I think the likelihood of that is zero. You know, I don't know if you're noticing, but Canada, for example, is back saying it's going to put a digital services taxes on again. In Europe, digital taxes are on the VAT tax. When you pay VAT tax when you buy something, digital is taxed there now too. India has an interest equalization tax. So India taxes digital already and has for years and has said it's not giving up its digital taxes. So I think Amount A has real problems. Amount B is pretty simple. And I think of it many ways as this is, you know, a book I read was a child and I read to my children, The Little Engine That Could. The little engine that could is the one that actually very slow moves along and makes it up the hill and makes it up the hill and then eventually gets over and is a success. I think a Pillar 1 Amount B is a little engine that can. It's going to actually make a difference. It's going to set baseline returns for all of the firms in the United States that sell overseas through distributors. So we sell in China, we sell in India, we sell in the European Union, we sell in Canada, and we have distributors all over the world now. We sell in Mexico City. We have American distributors in Mexico City selling. This is going to get rid of disputes between the Hacienda, the Mexican Tax Authority, and the IRS over what the returns are to those distributors that are in Mexico City. Or the same thing between Hacienda and the IRS over Mexican firms that are here in Laredo. This is going to be, I think, the little engine that could. Now, Mount A, on the other hand, I think is the big dragon in the problem. I think this is in many ways, and it's the thing I've written the most. If you go to my website, Voice of the Professor, so it's voxprof.com, you go to my website and you start looking at my publications from 1920 on, you'll see me writing a lot about Mount A. I really think this is a disaster waiting to happen. We have, it's based on formulary apportionment. We have formulary apportionment in the United States at the state level. Now, Texas is not part of it because Texas does not have a corporate income tax act. But there's a compact of over 30 states in the United States that have a compact to collect corporate income tax at the state level and then parcel it out based on an allocation formula. And it used to be a 3-part formula. It's now basically a 1-part formula, which is just sales. So if you have a lot of sales in your state, you get more. And so there's enough people, how should I say this, firms have an incentive to try to shift their sales into states where the corporate income tax rate is low. So you want to move your money out of California. You want to move your money out of New York. Why? Because California and New York have the highest corporate income tax rates. And you can still do that with this. The other thing I wanted to say is we raise almost no money with this. You know, the taxes that you pay when you buy gasoline, that's about the same amount of tax that is raised at the corporate income tax level in the United States. It's not much more. So we don't raise much money. And the proposal is to make this formulary apportionment through Amount A, every country in the world is going to have to do this. We're going to have allocation keys, and we're going to divvy up the money, and about 100 multinationals are going to pay some money, and everybody's going to fight over who gets who gets what, and there's no federal government at the top to make sure this works. Anyway, if you're interested in more about it, I have lots on my website that you can read. Now, I am not the only individual who thinks this is a bit crazy. And I wanted to show you a couple that do think that this is a bit crazy. I spoke at the American Bar Association. The DC branch has a meeting in January, the tax group. And I spoke at the American Bar in January, and the US Treasury had just called for comments on Amount A and asked taxpayers all over the United States to write about Amount A. I'm pulling in 3 that I respect and showing you what they said about Amount A. So this is the American Petroleum Institute, important for Texas. It says, Amount A involves radical departures from well-established tax rules. The formula is not supported by empirical evidence or a cogent economic analysis. It uses formulary apportionment in direct conflict with what we had in the OECD that said formulary apportionment was a mistake. The rules are not grounded in policy principles or supported by a clear rationale. What are we going to get? More uncertainty, more tax disputes, and more double taxation. So this is the American Petroleum Institute. Here's the Business Roundtable on the same thing. Now these are comments they filed with the US Treasury. They're online. You can go in, read them. The links are there, so you can click the link and go read them for yourself. Business Roundtable says this is one of the most complicated pieces of legislation we have ever seen proposed. It's a significant departure from long-standing principles. We can't predict what's going to happen. It's not likely to enhance stability or certainty or to even solve for the digital economy. All right, and then it says, we think that it might even move a fair amount of money outside the United States. There's a possibility. And I'll end with one more. Here, the Tax Foundation. And Tax Foundation does some of the pictures in here from the Tax Foundation. If you really want an understanding what's going on in the U.S. tax system, I recommend reading the Tax Foundation. They basically have an online training program where you can learn about taxes, and it's very friendly, user-friendly. Overly complex, untethered to economic circumstances. And note this, it makes very little economic sense. It's politically convenient. It was a politically convenient deal. The approximations are awkward. It's not transparent. It's even more complex than what we have at the state level in the United States. And the last point is not ready for adoption. In other words, it's not ready for prime time, which is a comment that I had been making basically since the 2020s. So that's Pillar 1. Remember I said Pillar 1 had an Amount A, which I don't like. And I'm not the only one that doesn't like it. I don't think it's going to happen, but we'll see. And Amount B that I think is a little engine that might help with some of these disputes. Let's talk about the other side, which is Pillar 2. Pillar 2 you've probably heard about. Pillar 2 is the one that's going to have a 15% minimum corporate income tax worldwide. And if you don't have one, if you're a tax haven and your tax rate is 5%, there are 3 choices. Choice number 1 is the home country gets to tax the extra 10 to bring it up to 15. In other words, if you keep your rate at 5, the home country, the residence country, can get the 10. If you don't move yourself, you could move it up to 15, right? And then you would get the full 15. Or then there's a really awkward approximation which says, you know, if you're Intel and you got 40 subsidiaries around the world, and so we're talking about a deal between, let's say, between Ireland and the United States. Ireland's the source, the United States is the parent. Then if the Irish won't do it and the United States won't do it, then the other 39 subsidiaries out together can get together and they grab it. And they'll divvy it up with a formula. It's like a huge sledgehammer to say that the other countries can take it, which I've never seen anything like that in the international tax system in my lifetime. So GLOBE is coming, and it is very clear. Countries are passing it now. Almost every day when I look in the paper, I see another country that has adopted GLOBE. Now, we've done nothing in the United States. You know what we have in the U.S.? We have guilty. Any of you heard of guilty? It's G-I-L-T-I, guilty. Guilty is kind of like globe. And the rates are a little bit of, it's not too far. And when this was originally proposed, the simplest idea was that guilty was going to be grandfathered in. We would just grandfather in guilty. We would be equivalent and everything would be good, except for this problem of the way that globe is set up with these three opportunities to grab the difference here, right? Either the residence country gets it or the source country gets it or a whole group of the others get together and get it themselves. So it's not clear here. In other words, there's possible dragons, I think, here in how this works out. But the U.S. so far has nothing, and it really is going to depend, I think, on the election in November and then what the U.S. Treasury decides to do in terms of this. But other countries are implementing now as they speak, and American multinationals and foreign multinationals in the United States, if they are paying an effective rate of less than 15%, are going to be open to other countries saying, under globe, we need to tax you. Now, let me explain what that means. Suppose it's a German multinational with an American subsidiary here. And we could, an American subsidiary here, just built a brand new plant, and it arranged for lots of tax preferences, a holiday. It has a tax holiday and doesn't pay any tax for the first 10 years to get that plant here, right? Well, I'm sorry. If the United States doesn't raise the tax to 15, the German tax authority can go after it as the residence principal. And if Germany and the United States won't go over it, whatever that company is elsewhere in the world, those tax authorities can go after it too. I don't know how that's going to work out in practice. What I do think is going to end up with a lot more cases in court, which means more money for who? Lawyers, right? It means much more money for the tax lawyers. The tax lawyer industry is going to be a very profitable industry potentially going forward. The last one, I think, may work. This is called the subject to tax rule, and this is going after what we call nowhere taxed income. This is income that isn't taxed anywhere in the world, not by a residence country, not by a source country. It just simply completely escaped tax altogether, just didn't get taxed at all. This is going to be a possibility for a source country to say, if you refuse to tax it, we can tax it, subject to tax rule, for 9%. It's going to set a 9% rate here. Now, it's more complicated than that, but it's possible this may come. But it has to be through tax treaties, and that's going to be very, very slow for tax treaties. So here's me coming back and saying about the globe and the guilty stuff. What will happen instead of, I showed you the early with worldwide taxation, we had that flat rate of 30 going across. This is going to be like a mini umbrella, right? Instead of having an umbrella over my head, I'm going to have an umbrella over my knees, right, at 15%. And then I think what will happen is that top-up tax is going to go to somebody to move that rate up. And that is, let me say, American multinationals in the United States right now woke up to the fact that this could affect the taxes they pay here in the United States about a year ago. Had not realized that it could actually affect here in the U.S. That firms here in the U.S., if they qualified for a special rate under real estate laws or whatever, that this is the possible additional tax that may happen. Okay, my assessment of this whole BEPS process. I think the BEPS 1 is happening very, very slowly. This is the one that's filling in all the loopholes, right? It's very, very slow through a multilateral instrument. I don't like Pillar 1 Amount A and have said so publicly many times. I think this is a real problem happening, and it doesn't fix the problem. I think that there's some possibilities with GLOBE, but there's some problems with that too. I like the little engine that could, which I think has possibilities, and then I don't know what's going to happen on the subject to tax rule. Now, did we fix number 1 in that list of 15 items? You remember what the number 1 in the list of 15 items was? It was, how do we tax those digital giants? What do we do about the Netflixes and the Amazons and the Apples and the Googles of the world? That basically, because digital goods and digital services aren't well captured in our tax rules yet. And so all this work done with Pillar 1, all this work done with the first BEPS round and the second BEPS round, everything the OECD has done to date really hasn't fixed it. And I don't think it is going to fix it. So one of the things that has happened here is I think DSTs aren't going away. And what happened here is the United Nations got involved. They were involved in the OECD project through something called the Inclusive Framework. The Inclusive Framework said if you're not an OECD member country, you're not a member of the Rich Country Club, we invite you to come to the table and we'll listen to you. And we will try to figure out policies that work for us all together, but the decisions are still going to be made behind closed doors by the group that are primarily residence-based countries. So the perception is this is neither inclusive nor is it fair. And the United Nations, led by two groups, interesting, I think you'd be interested in this, led by a group of what's called the African Club, which is a group of African countries, and by the LATAM group, which is all the Latin American countries, basically all the way down, have got together, and the two groups have argued we need to do something at the multilateral level at the UN, something that is going to be fairer here. It started with what is called the Addis Ababa Agreement, focused on illicit financial flows. You remember I showed you all that money coming out? There have been estimates on the money that has simply come out of high tax country locations and has flown into tax havens. And then the African group in November 2022, so this is not quite 2 years ago, put a resolution at the UN General Assembly, not in the tax committee, but the whole UN General Assembly. And the proposal was we need to think about setting up something that is international cooperation at the UN level. Not OECD, but everybody. Everybody at the table, one country, one vote. We all talk about it, majority rule. We think about trying to establish a new system here. And it passed. That proposal, 77-244, passed. Now, guess who voted against? America. The United States voted against. Canada voted against. So did Mexico. The OECD countries basically voted against or abstained. It still passed. And what that resolution did is it instructed the UN Secretary General, Anthony Guterres, and it said, Secretary General, you need to come up with some ideas about how we could implement a form of international cooperation at the whole level of the UN. And he did. He went off to work on this, invited people to submit their proposals. I submitted. Lots of people submitted. They're all up on the internet. He had meetings. The meetings were all on UN TV. You know, you could see all the countries that were there. And then that happened in 2023, and they had another meeting where they voted, actually, I guess this was last December. They voted last December to open this up and create something called a Framework Convention on International Tax. Now, a Framework Convention sets up a big overall convention like an umbrella, and then you have protocols under it. And I see we're getting a little short for time, but I want to show you what a framework convention. I want to point you to the bottom one. There's a framework convention on climate change. You've probably heard about the Kyoto Protocol, for example, and the things that we do, the United Nations is doing on global warming. We have other framework conventions, and the proposal here is to do one of these in tax.
Yeah, but that's all John Kerry and Al Gore flying their jets to Switzerland and then preaching to us about
global warming.
Yes, and you say that's crazy. I'm going to trust these countries to do that. Doesn't make sense.
Well, I don't know.
I don't think so.
Well, I respect your opinion. I respect your opinion. I'm more optimistic. Maybe I'm just a natural-born optimist, and maybe I'm a Canadian, and I actually believe in free trade, the Canada, the NAFTA, and these issues. But I think there's a possibility here to maybe do something. But I do admit we're not going to do it without the United States. If the U.S. doesn't buy in and doesn't get involved, it ain't going to happen. That ain't going to happen. It is not going to happen. But we need a UN level process has the opportunity to actually, I think, do for tax what the WTO and the GATT did for trade, what the United Nations has been able to do for investment through bilateral investment treaties. I think it offers the opportunity for all countries to speak. One of the interesting things is on this last round of negotiations, when they called the roll vote, which was the end of August, on the proposed terms and conditions, guess what? Canada did Canada abstain this time? No, Canada's still voting no. The United States is about Mexico abstain. So Mexico shifted from voting no the first time to abstaining on this round. And many of the European countries that had all voted no the first time are now moved to abstentions. My hope is that by talking about some possible benefits of here, we might bring some of the Canada, Mexico on board, and even possibly the United States. Now, are there going to be problems? Yes. Opposition from the OECD countries, difficulty with doing this, and the same problem with getting a lot of people in the room talking. But I think there is some possibility, I guess I'm going to do it this way. My assessment, I think it's a once in my lifetime opportunity to do something at the UN level, right? On a multilateral level. It will be fairer, it will be more inclusive, it will represent all the countries in the world. It could establish, bringing us back to what we had when I first started, of this talk about what was a system that actually worked, where entities did pay their fair share. It's not that I really believe firms should pay lots of tax. I just think they should pay their fair share, right? Firms like all of us, if multinational enterprises don't pay taxes, somebody has to pay them, and that means they fall on domestic business and on you and me, right? Through our personal taxes and our sales taxes. We all need to pay our fair share, including the very largest of the digital giants. So let me stop here and say one last thing about Texas. I said we've got an election coming up. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act expires this coming year. We had proposals for a significant increase in U.S. tariffs. The border issue is still a huge issue here, as you know. I don't know whether the U.S. would ever get involved in doing this. The last thing you've probably heard is the U.S.-Mexico Free Trade Agreement is up. It's up for renewal next year. Former President Trump has said he wants to renegotiate. The Canadian Prime Minister has said, we're up for renegotiation. And I don't know what the new Mexican president has said in response. But we're looking at the possibility of the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement being renegotiated next year too by a new president of the United States. So it's hard to know what that means. Now, I've learned since I've been here the last 2 days that Laredo is the single largest port of entry in the United States, and maybe it's like 5th in the world or something like that. Should you care about free trade?
Yes.
Should you care about investment?
Yes.
And foreign investment?
Yes.
And multinational enterprises?
Yes.
Do you need to care about tax?
Yes.
Yes, you do. Because I don't care. You can build the rule of law. You can put the infrastructure. You can put ways that autonomous trucks can run along I-35, right? And more trains go across. You can build more bridges across the Rio Grande. But somehow you also have to pay attention to the taxes that firms pay here. And there are some really kind of wild choices coming down the tubes. There are. Anyway.
Laredo doesn't give incentives to anybody for what a record.
Well, that I don't know. But maybe Texas does, and lots of states do.
Yes.
And I'm not against incentives. I really am not against incentives. I think incentives are great. But the problem is this globe is going to come after many of these incentives. And that means you have to redesign the incentives so they don't fall under the globe. Otherwise, they just simply get taken away. Anyway, I've talked long enough, so let me pass it over to Dr. Clark here. And then I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Maybe I'll leave the Texas slide up. One last comment, and I will say, I'm quite happy for any of you to have my slides. I hope they can be made available to you. I have sent them in, and then you can have a chance. And there's a lot of words on the slides, and I went pretty fast. And but please have a look at the slides, and then, if you want, go to my website, read some of the stuff that's going on in the newspapers. This matters for us, and it matters for Laredo, and it matters for Texas. And I can say that because I'm a yellow rose of Texas now. I am, thanks to the governor. But I hope that you'll get involved. And as I said, I've had a lot of Aggies study with me over the years and found, I think, pretty successful careers in this. Class of 77. Well, congrats. Whoop. Anyway, let me pass to Dr.
So thank
Clark.
you very much. So we'll now do questions. I would ask that you don't ask questions unless you have a microphone in your hand. The reason for this is that we're trying to record this for viewing. And if you speak without a microphone, however loud you speak, our viewers online can't hear it, and our and our people who are watching it on recordings can't do it. So we have questions over here. If you have a question, please put your hand up, and if you can also enter questions on Sligo, and I will read them if you don't want to speak out loud.
Hello, my name is Chendo Carranco, and I'm class of 77 from A&M. I had a few comments. One, the banks in the Cayman Islands don't look like banks or towering buildings. They're like little houses made out of wood, and the money's not there. It's everywhere else but there.
Somewhere else. Yeah.
I'm a CPA by trade.
Okay.
But I was going to say, with the CFC and guilty and all our laws that have changed, especially in 2016 and 2017, the passive income has been taxed as far as back as we go, even if it wasn't distributed from corporations, right? And we control all of the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas, and we have a tight-knit group. We used to be able to transfer millions of dollars and transfer them back, but because of the money laundering, we can't do that anymore. Right. But my point was, in guilty, all the U.S. corps pay tax.
Yes.
If it's not distributed.
Right.
In fact is, when Trump went in, he had a great idea. He taxed all the current assets at 15%, and then the fixed long-term assets portion of the retained earnings from 1986 to 2016 at 8%.
Right.
So we brought all the money back.
But
then Congress, in its infinite wisdom, decided to tax everyone. So us here, we have a lot of Americans with corporations in Mexico, for instance, and other countries. So now we file 5471s that are between 22 and 50 pages long.
Yes.
A tax return that we used to charge $1,800 is now $12,000.
Paperwork's amazing.
Plus the tax, and it's crazy. So how would this affect us? And by the way, I don't ever think the United Nations would be fair. I admire you for fighting the good fight. But anyway, that's my point. Ask Israel what they think about them saying that they're, terrorists. But anyway, do you think, how would it affect guilty, and would that change? And do you think it would ever change for small companies or individuals with foreign corps?
Okay. I think there's two points to this. One, I had originally thought that guilty would be grandfathered in, and guilty would be kept. So the Tax Cut and Jobs Act would actually be renewed when the time was up. But depending on what happens in the election, it's going to be up to Congress. So we don't know what Congress is going to do. Well, I don't know. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act, a lot of it expires next year, right?
And the inheritance tax as well from
all kinds of stuff. Anyway, we don't know. We don't need to go in the details. But the devil is always in the details. So my point in saying this is, I think what the United States did with guilty was good. All right. Some of the stuff I had problems with because some of it actually contravenes the gap. It did. It was an artificial substance, and we don't need to talk about that either. But my point in saying this is, I think the U.S. led the way in trying to put that mini umbrella on, and it was great. All right. And it really did help in the United States. The proposal that's coming down from the OECD is not that. And it is not based the way the U.S. guilty rules are. I would rather the OECD had adopted guilty, right, or close to guilty, than what's coming. And as I said, I marked it and said, this is a possible dragon as far as I'm concerned, because I do not like the sledgehammer of this undertaxed profits rule that's coming. So that's the first thing. My second comment is, I get you with the paperwork. I think we're all finding that when we file taxes now, and you have to file all this notifications, and I'm a Canadian in the U.S., so I have to file FBAR, as well. It's a lot of paperwork. Our accountants are busy. I think we need a simpler tax system. I think often all of those loopholes are there because some firm wanted an advantage, lobbied hard with their congressman or their senator, and got some changes made that were useful for that firm, but made the whole system much more complex for the rest of us. So I think we need a fairer and simpler system. And maybe one reason why I think things might be useful at the UN, most developing countries have very small tax administrations. They don't have the ability to do any of these really complex. They couldn't do guilty. It's too complex. They don't have the staff. They can't do Pillar 1 Amount A. It's impossible for them to do it. So when I talk to the LATAM group and to the African group, the people at ATAF, for example, what I hear is they want a simpler tax system, less loopholes, simpler. And frankly, I think it's one of the reasons why I like digital sales and services tax. It's easier to do a value-added tax. The United States is the one country in the world that doesn't have a federal sales tax. We don't have a VAT. Everybody else has a VAT. But it's simple.
We don't want the federal government involved any more than they have to.
Well, my point in saying is I agree with you, we need a simpler tax system. The complications lead to loopholes. The loopholes mean people who have money can exploit them, and the rest of them end up paying the tax. So what it means is small and medium-sized businesses pay more tax. Domestic firms pay more tax. You and I pay more tax. We have to pay more tax on all kinds of things that we wouldn't have to do if some of these very big firms paid their fair share.
And I like your maroon sweater.
Oh, thank you. Well, close.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any more questions from the audience? Anyone in the audience? You have a question over here? If you're online, feel free to enter your questions into Microsoft Teams, and we will read them out here.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, madam, for your inspiring work in international business, especially the recent paper on ethics and international business. It's so fascinating. My question is how this framework is related to other UN goals like SDG, climate change. We talk about carbon accounting, carbon trading, and taxing for environmental degradation, which is not nowhere actually as an instrument. So what's your take on that, and what are the plans of UN regarding that?
That's a great question too. And let me say, if you have some time to go and read, for example, the report that was done on the ad hoc committee on the terms of reference for setting up this framework convention. There's a direct commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals in it. There's a commitment to human rights. I think one of the very first things they'll work on is illicit financial flows, and they have a matrix that defines when flows move from legal to illegal and the types of flows. So I think there will be the whole idea is to be more inclusive and be fairer, more equitable. So I'm, as I said, I may be pie in the sky thinking about this, but I think this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for me and our generation and your generation to actually get a fairer system. If we could just get, the United States, Canada, and Mexico to the table and get, excuse me, I need a drink of water, get them involved. So I'm lobbying hard.
So let me continue with some of the online questions that we have. So again, if you're online, I encourage you to use the Q&A session to type in, and then we will read them out here. And you can be anonymous or not anonymous, depending on what you want. So we do have an anonymous question here, and this is: what's your opinion of the very high proposed tariffs on imported goods, and how will this interact with the tax system that you've been talking about?
Thank you for the question. You need to know that I taught international trade for many years, and I'm a believer in open economies and actually getting tariffs down. So I am not in favor of raising tariffs. I think tariffs will make the gross national product of the economy much smaller and will end up with us being much poorer. The other thing is tariffs, other countries retaliate. You put on tariffs, other countries turn against and retaliate against you. And we had that happen in the 1930s. We got a trade war with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the 1930s, and we all ended up a whole lot poorer with a recession, and the only thing that stopped the recession was World War II. So, I really think moving to huge tariffs would be a real disaster for the United States and for Laredo. I mean, put tariffs on, you want to slow trade? It's just like putting on transportation costs. Matter of fact, when economists model tariffs, they model them the same as transportation costs. That they're a drag on trade. And when trade slows down, and trade is two-way, it's a win-win situation. Trade is as a benefit for both countries here. Now, it is true that a really large country with a lot of bargaining power can put on a tariff and force other countries to pay for it. And we could do that at the end of World War II, when we were the only really large country standing in the world. We're not now. The United States is a much smaller percent of the global economy, and if we try to throw our weight around by putting on huge tariffs, consumers will pay for it. Many of you will have studied some basic economics. You understand about supply and demand curves and elasticity, right? You can pass a tariff on to somebody else if there's no other alternative, and they pay it, right? That's not going to happen in the United States. We're too small to force other countries to bear the burden of our own tariffs. Now, Canada, small open economy. Mexico, small open economy. We've known for a long time our future lies with free trade, right? Because we can't pass tariffs on, we can't beggar thy neighbor. Putting tariffs on or beggaring thy neighbor, and we're not the hegemon we used to be at the end of World War II. I don't think we can do that can't throw our weight around. And what's really interesting is at the end of World War II, look what the United States did. It set up free trade. It brought Japan into the trading system. It helped create the European Union. It set up the GATT. I mean, it was the force for good that led to opening the global economy. And look at the growth that happened. From the time I was a little child growing up to where we are now. We are thousands of times sort of richer than we were when I was born. Your generation is just much, much wealthier than the rest of us. It is. So my view is no, I don't think. One tariff retaliating against something, fine. But wholesale across the board, it will turn around and bite us. We'll pay for it in much higher taxes. We will. There's a question right here.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation and discussion. I have a simple question about digital products, because
Yes.
we've been discussing this. How do we determine the fair price of a digital product? Because regardless of how much tax we impose, either as income tax or value-added tax or otherwise, the creators or providers of the service have the final say in how they want to price the product to offset those taxes. So I'm going to the point of looking at this from tax planning versus tax avoidance versus tax evasion levels of adjusting the prices. So since you are an expert on transfer pricing aspect, have you ever given thought on how digital products are priced and what is the consumer's right with reference to the fair price of a digital product?
Okay, that's a great question again. Let me say I've been arguing for some time that I think the United Nations, I first suggested the OECD, but I think the United Nations too, needs to take this up. And one of the things I have a proponent of is we use the term DST very loosely. There's a difference between digital sales of a product, and what I mean when I buy a book, a Kindle book, that's a digital sale of a product, right? That's very different than when I buy on a digital platform like Amazon or Wayfair and I get the product actually delivered, a physical product delivered to my door. Although Amazon also will deliver me digital books, because I can buy from the Kindle. That's different than me providing a digital service, online training. Texas A&M offers, Texas A&M International offers an online MBA, That's a digital service that's being provided, that is being charged for. There's a difference in terms of what I think of as digital assets. This is the data that we buy, right? And the algorithms, and the software programs, and the ChatGPT-4s, and the perplexities, and that the firm valuation on some of these is just unbelievably large, as we know. And then lastly, there's digital investment. How do we know when something is sold? Let me use Texas A&M International. Texas A&M International is an MBA program, offers a course in managerial economics, and a student in Malaysia takes it. And the student pays tuition fees to take that course. That's a digital service being provided from the United States to Malaysia. Does the Malaysian government have the right to tax it? We come back to the rule on nexus. Nexus says, is the income effectively connected in Malaysia? Is there a permanent establishment there? Then it has the right to tax it, right? So my first point is to say, I think you have to separate out the types of digital, and we really have done that poorly. And platforms like Amazon and Wayfair and Uber, right? And what's the one where VBRO, right? And Airbnb, these platforms, the economics behind platforms and how you charge for platforms. And some of them, of course, I use Google, although I've pretty much switched to Perplexity now. The ads that show up, right? On here, they don't charge you. I'm not charged for using Google, but Google gets it because it gets my eyeballs and somebody else pays advertisement for it. What I'm trying to say is we started in 2012, and I would argue the real digital economy started about the year 2000. But about 2012, the OECD started a project trying to figure out how to handle digital. This is 2024, almost 2025, and we are no further ahead than we were. The American states are further ahead. The Wayfair case, which was, I can't remember, it was Maryland or Delaware?
It was South Dakota.
South Dakota.
Against Wayfair.
Yes, and the state won. Sales got the right to levy sales tax on Wayfair because it was considered to be effectively connected and selling inside. And as I said, Amazon now pays taxes. Now, the price of these is a different issue, but I am a believer in demand and supply, and that having markets and competition helps establish a price. There's usually two ways to establish a price. One is based on the cost of what went into it, and that would be the typical accounting way, cost plus, and then you do it on the market valuation, right? Either the market valuation of the firm back down or the market valuation of the product. And I think we could do that with digital too. So I have been proposing for some time, we need to add a chapter to the transfer pricing guidelines of the OECD and the transfer pricing manual at the UN, where we separate digital goods from digital services, from digital assets, from digital, what else do we need? Digital investments and other kinds, digital platforms. I'm talking to a group of business school students. The simple way for me to tell you what the answer to the question I was just asked, we need to understand the business model. These business models are different from the business models we had before. We need to understand the digital business models, the big data models, and the ChatGPT and the AI, and who has the intellectual property rights if AI creates, an algorithm of Lorraine Eden and puts it up on the web, is that mine or does it belong to the AI that created it? I don't know, on here. So we live in a new world, right? We really do. Yes.
On the price transfers. Oh, sorry. On the price transfers, what I've seen in my practice, and I've been practicing as a sort of in public accounting for 48 years.
Wow.
Nonstop.
Congratulations, 2 more years.
Well, my CPA, I got into real estate, so I need 4 more years. But anyway, I've always been in public accounting. One of the things that we've noticed is because of our lower tax rate, Mexicans are leaving their money here.
Yes.
And so they asked me, do we need a price transfer study in U.S.? And I wanted to ask you a question because my reply is, we're leaving our money here. I think I can beat any IRS agent if they try to fight me on the price transfer. I think what you need your price transfer, and they do it, is in Mexico, because that's where you're going to have the problem, because we're selling cheap here from Mexico, and we're selling here, and we leave all the money here. Is there something wrong in my thought process?
I don't
or-
know, and I'm not sure. I think I probably won't touch this one with the IRS. But what I will say is a very simple example there are huge differences in personal income taxes across the United States, as you know. We don't pay a personal income tax here in Texas. You do pay, well, I forget what it is, something like 15% on top in California, and it's higher even again, I think, in New York, because there's a city of New York tax as well as a state of New York tax.
California's the same. I prepare tax
And
returns in
and
both
where are people moving to? The flow is here. Now, for migration, I saw the Tax Foundation's been tracking this really interesting picture I saw the other day of the flow of people moving into Texas. And you see that here in Laredo, you see it in Austin, you see it in Houston, you see it in Dallas. We even see it in College Station, right? This place is booming. It is. And so that's an interesting question. It is. But there are different, we respond to differences in taxes and subsidies. We do. As individuals, we're rational actors. I guess I would say one thing. I do think developing countries, they just don't have the administrative ability to handle really complicated. They're just, the income is small, and you and I both know about, what's going on in Venezuela, what's going on in Haiti, the level of difficulty that many countries have with hyperinflation, exchange rates falling through the floor, just unemployment rates that are skyrocketing. So these issues are difficult issues.
No food.
No food, yes.
Okay, so we have one more question online. This is again from Anonymous. You mentioned that overseas profits can be tax deferred. I was under the impression that Guilty would avoid tax referrals and tax overseas profits every year. Is that correct?
It taxes particular kinds of profits if they're less than 15%. Yes. That's the discussion that we were having earlier. That one of the things Guilty did is it moved to an accrual basis. Remember I said accrual is you don't defer, you get to bring it back. And that's why I thought Guilty was actually a better solution than some of the Globe proposals were here, is that would establish a minimum floor. Now, what that means is, one of the problems with Guilty is it's not easy to credit the local taxes that are already paid there. So that becomes a bit of an issue. And there's a couple of other complications. Let me just explain. What Guilty does is if you suppose I talk about Ireland and Germany, the Irish rate is below 15%, the German rate is above. What Guilty does is allows you to blend. So you blend for all the subsidiaries and all the countries on a worldwide basis. And so you can blend and get 15, but Ireland is still below 15. The one thing Globe did is Globe said you can't do that. We want you to do it on a country-by-country basis. You cannot amalgamate them all. And that, I think, would be preference, because that would then say to the Irish, if you don't put 15% of your own tax on, then I'm sorry, you can't just blend it in and hide behind, the German tax rate or the tax rate in Kenya, for example. So there are some differences. There are things I don't like about Guilty that I think could be fixed, but there's things I think also about Globe that would make it simpler and fairer, and then would establish that floor. Won't bring us back to where we were sort of in 1940, but I think maybe it's a better way. Countries are not going to move from territorial back. The other thing I should say to you is we have pretty good controlled foreign corporation rules, CFC rules here, which is the taxes on passive income. But we have something called check the box that's been around since the late 1980s. And check the box enables firms to pretend that they aren't real firms and therefore don't have to pay tax. And check the box has been heavily used with the Irish multinationals, for example. And that's still there. I remember going to a UN meeting at UNCTAD, all right, in Geneva, with a round table of people all sitting talking about tax, and they were talking about tax havens. And everybody in the room, I'm sitting there as the American in the room, and everybody in the room says that, you know who the biggest tax evader is? And they say it's the US because it checked the box. And we still haven't fixed that problem. So I would fix check the box. I would adopt across all countries together, get rid of that out of GILTI. And then so the Irish would have to raise in 15. And then I think, one of the big advantages, we haven't talked about this, I think a lot of the really small countries don't really want to be tax havens. Who was the person that said about the Cayman Islands? Oh, the Cayman Islands and the small banks that are there, and the money just goes in and goes out. That doesn't create jobs, or very many. That money goes in and goes out. But if everybody's... Well, Bermuda, Bahamas, a variety. Macau. My last point in saying this is I think there are many countries that have put really low tax rates to try and attract some kinds of investment in, that would be glad to have a higher rate and put in a better education system and better infrastructure, better digital infrastructure, create better jobs for their population so their kids can stay at home. One of the things I learned was that many Laredoans like to go to school here and they want to stay here. And in College Station, I know that most Texans want to stay in Texas. I think there's many people in a lot of countries that are much, much poorer than us that their children would like to stay at home. I think Mexicans often would like to stay in Mexico if they could get good jobs and we have better infrastructure. And you need tax revenues to do those things, to put a school system in, for example. Anyway, we're off topic.
We really have to
Yeah.
finish.
One quick comment. I just want to say that as a CPA, I've been to a lot of these kinds of seminars with top-notch speakers, and I rank you among the best, if not the best.
Thank you. Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. And thank you to Dr. Eden for an excellent talk. Before everyone leaves, I want to thank everyone who makes this possible. I'd first like to thank IBC and Commerce Bank again for their generous support that allows us to do it. I would like to thank Amy Palacios, the Associate Director for the Center of Study of Western Hemispheric Trade, who does more to keep this thing happening than anybody else does. So thank her. Finally, I want to thank the staff in the School of Business, OIT, Event Services, and the students from the Dean Student Advisory Council who have helped with this event. And finally, I want to thank everybody for coming in person, and thank you for coming online. And I have a little award for Dr. Eden, which is our globe.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's beautiful. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So thank you all for
Dr.
coming, and
Clark.
thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.